She was almost 30 years old, and she had never been afraid of the dark. She had been raised above it, above the city, above the people, above the smoke and the prayers and the drums that beat through every midnight. But tonight was different. The young princess of Tenochtitlan stood alone on the highest terrace of the great temple and watched the sky begin to bleed. It started as a shimmer, a trembling at the edge of the horizon. Then the color came, deep red like copper poured across the heavens. And then the star. Long, bright, wrong. A burning streak ripped across the night sky above Tenochtitlan, the greatest city in the Americas. It hung there like a wound in the darkness, like a blade drawn and not yet swung. Below her, the city still glittered. Canals caught the moonlight. Torches burned on 1,000 rooftops. Priests chanted in low voices from the temple platforms below. Somewhere in the distance, drums. But the drums felt quieter than usual. The chanting, uncertain. She had been raised to believe the gods spoke through fire, through storms, through blood. So, when the sky turned red, when that burning star refused to fall, she did not see beauty. She saw a warning. And something in her chest, something ancient and animal, already knew. This was not a sign from the gods that they were pleased. This was a sign that something was coming, that nothing could stop. Before the empire fell, the sky itself warned them. But to understand why that warning mattered, you have to understand what she stood to lose. She had no memory of a world before the palace. That was the thing about being born into power. The gold didn't dazzle you. The marble floors weren't remarkable. The servants who lowered their eyes when you passed. That was simply the way things were. She was a daughter of the Aztec royal court, born and raised beneath the rule of Montezuma II, a man treated not merely as king, but as something approaching the divine. From the time she could walk, she moved through halls of polished stone, past walls painted in brilliant ochre and jade, past noble women draped in quetzal feathers and gold ornaments, past warriors who turned their faces when she passed, out of reverence, not disrespect. She learned her prayers at sunrise. She sat behind silk screens during royal audiences and listened to governors from faraway provinces report their tribute. She ate from ceramic dishes painted with hummingbirds, and at night she would sometimes climb to the palace rooftop and watch the torches of the city below. 10,000 flames, flickering like a second sky. Normal. All of it. Just normal. That may be the strangest truth about privilege. When you are born inside greatness, you mistake it for ordinary. But Tenochtitlan was anything but ordinary. The city rose from the middle of a great lake. Not beside it, not near it, from the water itself. 3 giant causeways stretched out from the island like arms reaching across the water. Canals cut through the streets where other cities used roads. Canoes slipped silently beneath stone bridges. An enormous aqueduct, 2 pipes running side by side, one always flowing, carried fresh water from the mainland into the heart of the city. The great market of Tlatelolco was said to leave visitors speechless. Tens of thousands of people on a single market day. Gold merchants beside potters. Weavers beside surgeons selling herbal medicines. Farmers beside jewelers. The noise alone, the shouting, the bargaining, the laughter, could be heard from across the lake. Some historians believe that in its prime, Tenochtitlan held more people than almost any city in Europe at the time. Think about that. An island city rising from a highland lake in the New World, larger than Paris, larger than London, larger than any city most European explorers had ever seen. And the princess had grown up at the center of it all. She knew every canal by sound. She knew which direction the wind carried the smell of the market. She knew which priests were kind and which ones frightened her. She knew the exact view from the temple terrace, the place she went when her mind grew too loud. This city was not just where she lived, it was who she was. And she had never once imagined it could end. Beauty has a way of hiding its price. The princess understood the glory of her empire before she understood its cost. She saw it first in celebration. Victorious generals returning home with feathered banners. Warriors draped in jaguar skins marching through the crowds. New provinces added to maps painted on bark paper. The people of Tenochtitlan lining the causeways to cheer. She was taught to see these things as glory. But she was getting older now, and older eyes see what younger ones refuse to. The Aztec Empire had not risen through peace. It rose through armies, through campaign after campaign, year after year, until city after city across Mesoamerica had been brought to its knees. Every conquered province was required to send tribute to Tenochtitlan. She watched the caravans arrive, lines of burden bearers stretching back beyond the causeway, bags of cacao, bolts of cotton, cages of birds, baskets of gold dust, each load catalogued, weighed, and stored in palace warehouses. This was the engine behind the marble, not magic, not divine favor, power. And then there was the other price. The first time she watched a sacrifice, she was in her mid-20s, old enough to understand, young enough to still be shaken. A prisoner of war was brought up the steep temple stairs. He was painted blue, barefoot. His eyes were wide and wild, searching the crowd for something. Mercy, perhaps, or just a familiar face. He found neither. The drums thundered. The priests lifted obsidian blades toward the sun. The crowd below roared with something that sounded almost like joy. And then it was done. She stood very still afterward. She did not cry. She had been taught not to. She had been taught that this was necessary, that without blood the sun would not rise, that without sacrifice the world would end. She had been told this her entire life. But standing there on the temple platform, watching the priests go about their work with practiced efficiency, watching the crowd disperse back into the ordinary afternoon, she could not silence the question forming in the back of her mind. What kind of gods require this? Not the question itself, that was dangerous, but the fact that she could no longer stop herself from asking it. She continued to wear the gold. She continued to speak the prayers. She stood in the ceremonies and said nothing, but something had shifted inside her. She could no longer pretend she didn't see the terror in those painted blue faces. She could no longer pretend she didn't wonder how many of those prisoners had names, families, people waiting for them to come home. Empires are built on things people agree not to say out loud. She had become very good at that silence. But silence has a weight, and the longer you carry it, the heavier it becomes. Fear has a sound to it. She had noticed it first in the servants, voices lowered in hallways, eyes that glanced toward the sky more than the gates. A particular kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like held breath. Then the signs began. A comet appeared and stayed, not for one night, but for many. It burned above Tenochtitlan like something left deliberately, like a torch planted in the dark to mark a place. Then one of the great temples caught fire. Without lightning, without warning, just fire swallowing ancient wood while priests screamed prayers into the smoke and the wind carried ash across the lake. The lake itself grew restless. Water that had always been still began to churn. It rose against the causeways, flooding streets where children played. The city's engineers worked through the night. The priests offered sacrifices to calm the water. Nothing helped. And in the black hours before dawn, or so the stories went, people walking alone in the streets heard something impossible. A woman weeping, moving through the darkness, crying for her children, crying that they were already gone. Whether it was real or not almost doesn't matter, because when enough people believe the gods are weeping, fear becomes its own kind of truth. And no one felt that truth more than Montezuma II. She watched it happen to him slowly, the man who had once received ambassadors with absolute stillness, spine straight, face unreadable, radiating the calm of someone who simply could not conceive of losing, began to change. He prayed longer. He summoned priests at midnight. He had old prophecies reread and reread again, looking for a different meaning in the same words. One prophecy would not let him rest, that one day a great god from the east, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl, would return to reclaim what was once his. She had heard this prophecy her whole life. She had never taken it literally. Most people didn't. But Montezuma was no longer most people. He was a man standing in the middle of omens, and omens had a way of making old stories feel suddenly, terribly real. She saw him one evening in the courtyard. He was standing alone, staring toward the eastern horizon. His hands were still. His face was unreadable. But his eyes had something in them she had never seen there before. Doubt. The most powerful man in the most powerful empire in the Americas, standing in the dark, quietly terrified of a god that might not exist. She understood then that the danger was not only outside the city walls. It had already found its way inside, into the mind of the man who was supposed to be unbreakable. And whatever was coming from beyond the horizon, it would arrive to find them already afraid. The messengers arrived at dawn. They had run through the night from the coast, 200 miles of mountain and jungle, and they were still trembling when they knelt before the court. She stood behind the screen at the edge of the great hall and listened. Mountains, the messengers said. Mountains floating on the water. Not mountains, ships. But they had no word for what they had seen, so mountains was what came out. Great wooden vessels with white sails that caught the wind like wings, larger than anything her people had ever built or imagined crossing the open sea. And from those ships had come men, their skin pale as ash, their faces obscured by dense, strange hair, their bodies wrapped in something that caught the light. Metal, the messengers thought, though they had never seen metal worn like clothing. But the thing that truly broke the court's composure, the thing that turned hard-faced generals into whispering men, were the creatures they rode. Horses. No one had seen them before. Great four-legged animals, larger than any deer, that obeyed the pale men's commands. Some witnesses were so disoriented they believed rider and beast were a single being, half man, half monster. And then there was the thunder. They carried weapons that produced fire and sound without warning. Men fell dead before warriors could even reach them. Not from arrows, not from obsidian blades, from something invisible and fast and final. The man who led them was Hernan Cortez, ambitious, methodical, and ruthlessly intelligent about the fear he inspired. He had landed on the coast with a few hundred soldiers. By any logical measure, it was not enough to threaten a city of hundreds of thousands. But logic had already begun to fracture in Tenochtitlan. Montezuma consulted his priests. He sent lavish gifts to the coast: gold, feathered headdresses, offerings appropriate for a visiting ruler or a returning god. She watched the gifts leave the palace. She watched the gold being loaded for strangers on the other side of the mountains, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. These are not gods, she thought. She didn't know who they were, but she knew what gold did to men. She had watched tribute caravans her whole life. She had seen what happened to the people who sent them. Sending gold to strangers was not an offering. It was an invitation. And Cortez accepted. He marched inland, and when he arrived at the gates of Tenochtitlan, the greatest city in the Americas opened its doors and let him in. She watched from the palace steps. Steel gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. Horses stamped against the sacred causeway stone. Foreign boots walked roads that no outsider had ever been permitted to touch. The city lined the banks of the canals and stared in silence, some in wonder, some in terror, some, she could see it in their faces, with a quiet, terrible knowing. Then came the moment she would carry for the rest of her life. Montezuma stepped forward, in full royal regalia, gold and jade and quetzal feathers, surrounded by his court, radiating every symbol of power his civilization had ever created. And he bowed his head, not deeply, just enough to mean something. She felt her chest tighten, because rulers do not bow unless they have already decided they are afraid. And in that single gesture, in that small tilt of a god-king's head, the old world began to die. It did not happen all at once. That is what people always misunderstand about collapse. They imagine it as a single moment, a wall falling, a city burning, a flag coming down. But this was slower than that, and in many ways worse. Trust collapsed first. Spanish soldiers, housed as guests in a royal palace, struck without warning inside the city walls. Warriors who had stood down out of deference to Montezuma's orders died where they stood, unarmed, confused, still not entirely sure what was happening. Violence exploded through corridors she had walked her whole life. Blood on polished stone, fire in the palace gardens, the same halls where she had listened to the sounds of the city below, now filled with screaming. But the cruelest part of what followed was not the Spanish soldiers. It was who marched beside them. Thousands of warriors from nations the Aztecs had conquered, men whose fathers had paid tribute, whose brothers had died on sacrificial altars, whose hatred had waited, patient and cold, for exactly this kind of moment. They came with weapons, they came with memory, and they came in numbers that overwhelmed everything the city had left. She understood it, standing in the smoke. This was the price of the empire, not paid to the gods, paid to the people the gods had never protected. The siege began. The causeways were cut, supply lines severed. The aqueducts that had carried fresh water into the city were destroyed. Famine came first. She watched children grow thin. She watched mothers scrape the ground for anything: roots, insects, the inner bark of trees. She watched warriors too weak to lift their weapons sitting against the walls of buildings they had defended for weeks. Then disease. Invisible, merciless, moving through the city faster than any army could. Smallpox, a disease her people had no name for, no immunity against, no priests who knew how to pray it away. The dead filled the streets, not dozens, thousands, and the living stepped over them because there was nowhere else to walk. And still the fighting went on. Block by block, canal by canal, temple by temple. She ran through streets she had known since childhood, past the market square, ash now, past the school where she had learned her prayers, rubble, past the neighborhood where an old woman used to sell flowers every morning, empty, silent, the smell of smoke where the flowers used to be. The water in the canals ran red. Smoke covered the sky so thickly that noon looked like dusk. On the final night, she fled across one of the broken causeways, with others, she didn't know how many, moving in the dark, not running, because it was too much debris to run, stepping around things she would not let herself look at. She stopped once, at the edge of the causeway, and looked back. The great temple of Tenochtitlan was burning. The same towers where she had stood and watched the comet, the same stones where priests had promised the gods were listening, where she had asked her silent, dangerous question about why the gods wanted blood. She had her answer now. The gods had said nothing. They had watched the city burn the same way they had watched everything, in absolute silence. And by the time the sun rose, the greatest city in the Americas was gone. She lived. That was the cruelest part. She survived the fire. She survived the hunger. She survived the disease that killed so many around her. She survived the long, disorienting walk into a future none of them had prepared for. And then she had to keep living. Years passed. Enough years that the wound stopped being raw and became simply a permanent ache. Something you carry the way you carry a bad leg after an old injury. Always there, always slowing you. Never fully gone. The Spanish built quickly. They tore down what remained of the temples and used the stones to build cathedrals. They filled in the canals and built streets over them. They renamed everything. Tenochtitlan became Mexico City. The lake shrank as the new city grew. The causeways disappeared under cobblestones. She walked through it sometimes. This city built on the bones of her city. She would find a particular corner, a place where she could still see, beneath the new construction, the angle of an old wall. A drainage channel that followed the path of a canal she had paddled as a girl. The curve of a road that had once led to a marketplace she knew by smell. These were the things the stones remembered, even when everything above them had been remade. She thought sometimes about the questions she had never been able to silence, the ones she had first asked as a young woman watching a blue-painted prisoner climb those temple stairs. What kind of gods demand this? She still didn't have an answer. Maybe the gods had demanded nothing. Maybe it had always been men, frightened men, powerful men, deciding what the gods required. Maybe the gods had been silent long before the fires came. And maybe that was the thing no priest had ever been willing to say out loud. She thought, too, about the nations that had joined the Spanish, the warriors who had marched against her city. She had hated them for a long time. It was easier to hate them than to ask why they came. But she knew why. She had always known. You cannot build an empire on suffering and expect the suffering to hold its peace forever. The empire had made its enemies carefully, one tribute caravan at a time, one altar at a time, one generation of grief at a time. And when someone finally came with weapons and an offer of revenge, those enemies had accepted. She could not blame them. She wished she could. It would have been simpler. The church bells rang across the new city at dawn. She had grown accustomed to the sound. That was perhaps the strangest thing of all, that the human mind could grow accustomed to anything, even the sound of its own world having ended. She stood at the edge of what had once been the Great Lake, smaller now, crowded with new buildings at its margins, the mountains still in the distance. Those, at least, had not changed, and she thought, the gold is gone. The palaces are rubble. The empire is a memory that even its survivors argue about. But the stones remain. Beneath the cathedral floors, beneath the cobblestones, beneath the new city that does not know what it stands on, the stones remember. Empires can call themselves eternal. Kings can call themselves divine. Priests can promise that the gods are listening. And still, time takes everything. Every last glittering thing. She turned away from the water and walked back into the city that had buried hers. She did not look back again. Once she was princess of the greatest city in the New World. Now, only memory remembers her name.